When you hear the word monopoly, what kind of image does that conjure up in your mind? For many people, when they hear the word monopoly, they think of John D. Rockefeller and the Vanderbilts and Carnegie Steel, and they think of these titans of industry that were exploiting the populations, taking money from them by no choice of their own, and the government decided to ride in on its white horse like a knight in shining armor and introduced antitrust laws and has been enforcing them ever since to stop the existence of monopolies, because free markets, of course, are the things that produce the monopolies, and the government is the savior to protect people from them. I am here to show you today that monopolies do not exist in free markets. And any monopolies that do exist only because of the government, not the other way around. Ready? Let's dive in. First, we need to understand what is a monopoly. If we look at Merriam-Webster, we can look at a few definitions. One of them is an exclusive ownership through legal privilege, command of supply, or concerted action. Another definition is exclusive possession or control. And then number 3 is a commodity controlled by one party. Investopedia describes it as a market structure where a single seller or producer assumes a dominant position in an industry or a sector. So we know that for something to be a monopoly, consumers must have no other option. So what are some examples of monopolies today? Utilities are a fantastic example of this, at least in the United States. When you move into a house, you have one option for your gas, for your water, for your trash, for your electricity. There is no competition because whether it's a private company or a government entity, there is one provider of that commodity, of that utility, and you have absolutely no choice whatsoever. That is a monopoly. Now let's look at another example of something that people tend to call a monopoly. Something like Amazon's Kindle, the Kindle version of books. Many ebooks are bought from Amazon in Kindle format. You can buy them in other formats, but most of them are bought in Kindles, and especially early on, they had a corner on this market. Another example would be things like iPhones, because Apple sells a lot of phones, and so if you have an iPhone, you're participating and you're contributing to the monopoly. These things are not examples of real monopolies though, because there is a choice. If you don't want an iPhone, you can buy an inferior product and buy an Android phone. If you don't want a Kindle, you can buy an EPUB, or you can go to Apple Books. There is choice. And further than that, there doesn't even have to be direct choice for it to not classify as a monopoly here. All we care about is actually the threat of competition. Let's take, for example, again, your utilities. Let's take your internet provider, actually, because this is an even better example of this. If you look at your internet provider, again, wherever you live, you've got one option here. The reason why you only have one option is because you don't have, maybe you have two options where you live. So I'll give you that. Maybe you have two options. The reason you don't have more though, is because other companies do not have the legal right to drill holes and deliver fiber cables to your house, even if you want to pay them for it. This is why years ago, Google Fiber tried to roll out. They were going to try and revamp internet across the country, and they couldn't do it. Even a company like Google couldn't break through the legal barriers necessary to provide a superior product that consumers actually wanted because laws prevented it. Now let's look at another example where it seems like there's really no choice, but there's no laws preventing it. Therefore, you'd think, oh, that's a monopoly. That example, I'm going to say, is YouTube. If you want long form video content that is not a social media platform like TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, you want long form video, YouTube is pretty much the only place to get that right now. That's where all the creators are putting their content, and that's because that's where all the people who are consuming that content are watching it. This means that if YouTube, for whatever reason, decides that it doesn't want you on their platform, they can lock you out of that entire industry. Maybe there are some other options, but they're not really up to the standards of YouTube, and there's really no market there. Really, if you want to create longer form video, you've got to be able to do it on YouTube. So you might look at that and say, hey, that classifies, that counts as a monopoly here because there's no choice. Said another way, you could say there's no competition. But like I said earlier, it's not about the existence of competition, it's about the existence of the threat of competition. Because in reality, there are other platforms out there. There's Vimeo, there's Rumble, there are plenty of others like Odyssey that are crypto-based. There are a lot of video platforms out there, just not a lot of people use them. And even if those platforms didn't exist, they could exist tomorrow. All you have to do is create that company, and here's the key. There are no laws preventing you from starting your own video hosting website. Which means that at least for now, people use YouTube because it's the best. People want to use it more than they want to use the other ones. And to the extent that that is no longer the case, the competition will take over market share from the incumbent. To the extent that YouTube abuses its monopoly, which it's, as we've seen here, is really not a monopoly, it's just the best product. To the extent that it starts to become not the best product anymore, it loses the majority of the market share. Let's look at Amazon's Kindle one more time. The reason Amazon's Kindle became so prevalent as the top format for ebooks is because of the way that they started off. When Jeff Bezos, you can read about this in his biography, it's called The Everything Store. When Jeff Bezos started the Kindle program, he said, hey, look, what we want to do is we want to have ebooks for people, but these are going to be insanely profitable. Like it's literally, there's no storage cost for us. There's no transportation cost, no shipping costs, nothing like that. So if we can get people to buy an ebook from us, it's going to be extremely profitable for us. But our margins are going to get squeezed depending on how much we have to pay the publishers, how much we have to pay for the book. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to break even on this. We're going to lose money on this at first while we develop it, and then we're going to start breaking even on it. Why? Because nobody will want to compete in a space that's not profitable. So he said, we're going to dump a bunch of money into creating the Kindle ecosystem. We're going to sell Kindles and we're not going to make any money on it. Because if we sell these Kindles initially at 20 bucks a pop, first of all, people will probably not want to jump on that new technology. They'll want the regular books instead because they're probably cheaper. But number two, we'll instantly have competition because everybody will see, man, this is a way to make a lot of money. Let's get in on it. So if instead we as Amazon sell these things at cost and lose money on this, then nobody else is going to come in and dump a bunch of money into creating their own ebook system because they won't be able to compete with our prices. And so they're not going to make money on this. So we will corner the market. Did it work? Absolutely it worked, but the threat of competition has never gone away. And so today, they are not the 100% market share monopoly of ebooks. There are competitors because the threat of competition was always there. And sooner or later, the threat of competition can always turn into real competition. And the impact that the threat of competition has on a business is the same impact as real competition. You must stay ahead of your competitors and you must constantly be improving so that you keep your market share. So if that's the case, how do real monopolies actually exist at all? Well, they exist by preventing competition. So how do you prevent competition? The only way to do that is by force. Now, what do I mean by force? When I say by force, I mean by use of force or by the threat of the use of force, which is the law. Because at the end of the day, the government is the only one with a monopoly on the legal use of force. And they do this by imprisoning people, by setting force laws and enforcing those laws, saying, hey, you can't do this. And if you do this, you're going to go to jail. And we're going to put you in jail by force. We're going to take you, arrest you, put you in handcuffs, and drive you somewhere where you don't want to be and keep you there by force. That's what it means. So by people complying with laws and then not experiencing violence as a result of complying with the laws doesn't mean that those laws are not enforced by the use of force. The threat of force is the same as the use of force. And the government is the only one with a legal monopoly on force. Therefore, they are the only ones that can enforce and cause real monopolies. Because at the end of the day, the only reason why you don't have more internet service providers, why you don't have more electricity providers, why you don't have choice for natural gas providers, why you don't have choice for water providers is because of the government's monopoly on the use of force. No competition is allowed. And if somebody tries to come in and compete with the government-sanctioned monopolies, they will be stopped by force. And in a free market where businesses and people are allowed to freely exchange if they want to, voluntary association, monopolies simply can't exist because the threat of competition will always be there. And the only time the threat of competition is eliminated is by using the legal monopoly on force from the government. Therefore, all monopolies, to the extent that they exist, are either the government themselves or they're monopolies created by the government. And one little bonus round for you here is that whenever somebody tries to stop a company from doing something in the name of protecting people from monopolies, pro tip, that's not the real concern. Look at who it is who is pushing the government to try and enforce its breaking down and stopping of monopolies. It is always the competition who is not good enough to survive. They're incompetent relative to the incumbent, so they try and use the monopoly on violence that the government has for their own advantage. Look at the very first antitrust laws for Standard Oil from Rockefeller. It was not the people. The people were not being exploited. None of the consumers cared. It was the competition who was getting put out of business because they weren't good enough to compete. So they went to the government and said, you need to put a stop to this because our livelihoods are at risk because we're not good enough to compete with Standard Oil. So pay attention, because every single time from now on, when you see somebody trying to stop a monopoly, it's not the consumers. That business is in that position because they're providing something the consumers want. So in free markets, it's not the consumers that want to put an end to the monopolies because those monopolies got there by providing a better option. And the threat of competition still exists. It's the existing competition that gets scared because they're not good enough. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.